You've discovered the Techno-Progressive Hub. Join us to fight for a high-tech and radically democratic future. I'm talking today to Mark Walker. Mark holds the Richard L. Hedden Endowed Chair in Advanced Philosophical Studies at New Mexico State University. He's a leading voice in the techno-progressive wing of transhumanism, and his work has been characterized by a rigorous attempt to ground radical enhancement within traditional ethical and political frameworks. He's perhaps best known for his genetic virtue thesis, although he's made many contributions since that. But his genetic virtue thesis argued that we have a moral imperative to use biological and genetic interventions to enhance human virtues. So we're going to be talking about that. But he's also authored several pivotal texts, including Happy People, Pills for All, which defends the right to mood control, to self-control of our mood, and Free Money for All, a sustained argument for basic income, universal basic income. And his works span a huge terrain, which we'll cover. But Mark is also serves as a member of the board of directors of the IET. And so thank you for joining us today, Mark.
My pleasure.
If someone asked me what you were as a philosopher, I don't know that I would have an easy answer. Do you describe yourself with overarching philosophical commitments, Kantian, consequentialist, something like that?
Um, I hold a position which is a minority of one, I believe. But I'm a skeptical dogmatist. That means that when you think about philosophical views, it's almost never the case that there's just sort of two in play. I mean, it's hard for Americans because we always think of like left, right, but as a Canadian, there was always at least three parties involved. But any kind of moral issue, philosophical issues, there's usually like at least three, often far more than that. Like even the case of religion, right? There could be no gods, one God, many gods. You know that when you teach philosophy, it's never so easy to think there's just two. And the skeptical dogma says when you have like multiple positions like that, and there's sort of serious arguments for each of the positions from people who you would otherwise think are intellectually similar to you, that you should think each of those is probably wrong. So it's a sort of form of skepticism, but the usual skepticism says, oh, you ought to suspend judgment here. This one says, no, you should think you're probably wrong about all these things. So I think um, if I were a Kantian, Kantianism, I think is probably wrong. Consequentialism, I think is probably wrong. Virtue ethics is probably wrong. Those are the big three in normative ethics. However, like when it comes to like having to act and sort of make judgments under that kind of uncertainty, I would lean to a sort of form of consequentialism, but without the kind of confidence that some of my colleagues have in their different views.
And you just published a book on this.
Yeah, it's a couple of years ago. Yeah, it's called Outlines of Skeptical Dogmatism. And there's sort of that one's more the kind of there's some sort of practical application, but it's more like the kind of overall argument for that kind of epistemic humility, and the follow-up one's more sort of in the philosophy of way of life kind of tradition. It sort of says that the best life for you is the one where you are a kind of a skeptical dogmatist. But when you apply it to your life, then I call that the signorant sage. The signorant being a single ignorance, as opposed to most people who I think are dignorant, the double ignorance. That's the distinction goes back to Plato, right? The doubly ignorant are ignorant about the subject matter and ignorant about their own ignorance, right? Where Socrates said he was ignorant about the subject matter, but he was at least a little wiser than the rest in that he knew about his own limitations there. So that's the signal ignorance.
So it's embracing intellectual uncertainty as an intellectual virtue in and of itself, but also something that would make you happier, more eudaimonic overall in your life.
Yeah, I mean it has sort of that feature, but the worry with them is generated by the sort of thought that everybody's sort of like a proto philosopher in a sense, that everybody has philosophical beliefs in the sense that they hold opinions about um, disputes that philosophers think a lot about, like cases of religion or politics, morality, and so on like that. So everybody has sort of philosophical beliefs, and it's despite all the disagreement about the nature of the, which is the right position. Almost everybody, well, everybody agrees that there are huge stakes for getting these things wrong. I mean, a simple case of abortion, right? The pro-life says, "Oh, you're at risk as an innocent child or something like that," and the pro-choice side says, "What's at stake here is basically the question of whether we ought to enslave women or not." So, like, slavery or murder doesn't, those sounds like pretty weighty kinds of things. And of
Mhm.
course, I mean, the politics is so familiar now about all the kinds of things that are at risk, that when you make the wrong choice, right? News Nozick will say, if you're not a libertarian, you're going to enslave people, right? And, the left will say you're going to unjustly let children not be educated, because of your absolutism about property rights. So, like, huge issues, and none of us want to make mistakes, but it seems almost inevitable that we will, given how many different positions there are. So the sort of thought is, how can you live the best life given that kind of uncertainty and almost seeming the inevitability of making those kinds of mistakes?
I'm going to try to finish Cyborg Buddha this year, and one of the things
Yeah,
that
about
I
time.
know, I know, I know, but one of the chapters, or one of the sections of a chapter that I need to work on is intellectual virtue and the ideas of holding ambiguity, the capacity to hold ambiguity. There's so much empirical evidence that openness to novelty and ability to tolerate ambiguities is key to general intelligence for human beings. So whether that constitutes wisdom or not, I mean, I don't like the term wisdom because it's too vague, but
Yeah, yeah.
at any rate, well, I'll try to parse all that out and get it on paper.
Yeah,
Um, you started with theology for your dissertation topic. You were working on Arianism. Could you just tell us what led you to that, and why were you trying to connect the issues of human enhancement to ancient Christian Gnostic heresies?
yeah. The dissertation wasn't on that. It was more on, it was a epistemological issue. Can you unite thought and being, and sort of like the old question going back to Plato or whatever. And the the dissertation sort of divided in two, and it said, if we do philosophy sort of the old way, a priori, then the minimum we need to do to be able to unite thought and being would be to justify logical laws. And so I try to show how that project really runs into kind of problems. And then sort of the other thought was, well, maybe we shouldn't have started with the a priori model. Maybe we should have been like naturalists. So the second half of it says, oh, okay, well, let's see if we can think of how we can sort of think about human beings having kind of a knowledge of the complete truth of the universe, at least in sort of outline or something like that. And that's when I kind of stumbled into transhumanism, thinking, but this was back in, I don't know, 1986, before I even knew what a transhumanist was. But the thought was this, is that it seems like a perfectly legitimate empirical conjecture to think that our intelligence is capped by the size of our brains. Like, we think about that every other being on this planet, every other species. It would be sort of like a minor miracle if we were just ideally suited to be able to understand reality and all its complexity. But at least, anyways, you could run the test and you could think about enhancing human beings. At first, I thought you'd have to do it the old school way of selective reproduction, but then I quickly started studying genetics and thought, oh gosh, we could do this quite easily. I mean, we could do it today. We could have done it 20 years ago. I mean, not ethically, but we could have just manipulated all these zygotes and seen what happens. I mean, that's obviously the ethical issue there. But yeah, so it seems like so my yeah, the sort of thought was, well, you could put this to an empirical test. And when I submitted that as a rough draft to the Australian National University, I got some kickback. Like one of the profs wrote back and said, your skill at tongue in cheek is well known, Mark. Maybe this whole thing is intended as a joke. And
you do tend to have a pretty light touch. What's one of your papers is just titled "Na na na da da da" or something like that.
oh yeah. Nana nana boo boo. The accuracy of your philosophical beliefs is doo doo.
Yeah. I like that light touch.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm not sure it goes over well in academic philosophy, but you got a chair out of it, so who cares?
yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, these ones, I've reached the second last stage of promotion in terms of academia. Next step is death. But yeah, I can't go any further. So yeah,
emeritus comes before death.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah,
Okay, well, I did my bachelor's thesis on Pentecostalism, and was very interested in theology, and I was thinking about going to become a minister, Unitarian minister, and ended up Buddhist monk instead. But I've always been very interested in the religious questions, and we did a conference together 22 years ago now.
yeah. Yikes.
Yeah, on religion.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, I remember that well. George was there, and
yeah, you organized the religion part of it, and and that was a lot of fun, and it led to a long-standing engagement with some of the other religious transhumanists out there, the Mormon transhumanists, the Christian Protestants. Now we've got Steve working on the Catholics. We've got a Muslim fellow working with the IET. I do stuff on Buddhism. So we've got quite a few religious irons in the fire. And as a consequence of my sociological background, I've never been entirely comfortable. My heart is with the new atheist kind of hostility, but my head is not, because I realize that for the vast majority of people, what the new atheists are complaining about is not what's in their head. That the vast majority of people's engagement with religion is about community and belonging and a vague sense of commitment to higher values and a sense of spiritual awe. But very few people are walking around arguing biblical literalism and that God intervenes in our affairs and every day, or whatever the other beliefs are that people complain about. And so as a consequence, I've never been as exercised about this question of religious transhumanism as some secular transhumanists have been, like Zoltan Isfan has been very hostile to that. The IET has been close to some of these people and tried to talk to them. Where are you these days with the IET and techno-progressivism and transhumanism are all kind of outpourings of the Enlightenment thought, as far as I'm concerned. Mm-hmm. And Enlightenment thought's always had this tension between religious observers who were trying to liberalize religion by metaphorizing certain kinds of beliefs or making the religions more consistent with contemporary science and ethics. And those who were holding out and were anti-Enlightenment, holding out for religious truths and, the religion trumps Enlightenment values. And do you think that there is that fundamental conflict? Is that the wrong way of thinking about it? For me, every liberal religious person is a victory, but I know that some people don't see it that way.
Yeah. One of the things that I haven't written about this, but I've been thinking about for a while is like there's some of the tension might be resolved by thinking the difference between like a normative and a descriptive theism. So the descriptive theism would sort of say there is a God or there are gods out there, and the normative one would say there ought to be. And so maybe you can maybe you're like an atheist in the sense that descriptively there is not one now, but there ought to be. And so part of what the strategy I'm trying to pursue with the humility part is to kind of look more for where we agree rather than where we disagree. So
There
if
ought to be,
you're
in the sense that we need a universal moral arbiter out there. There ought to be, because ontologically we wouldn't exist if there wasn't a God.
no,
What do
no,
you mean
well,
by
so
there ought to be?
like, yeah, so like, it would be a better world if we were better
Being
people.
judged.
Well, no, if we were better people, and so how do we become better? Well, we become morally better and intellectually better. Where should that stop? Well, as far as you can see, it's just an iterative process where you end up becoming, or at least our descendants become divine themselves. That would be like the end of the moral project. So there ought to be gods, and that Neo-Aryan theodicy, it sort of says that there's a moral duty for us to become, you know, grow up as God's children, assuming kind of a broadly kind of Christian theology. There's sort of like a moral duty to do that. You don't need God to have that kind of moral duty. It can still just be the case that if you take seriously the idea that we want to, and our lives to be as good as possible and the universe to be as good as possible, the only way you're going to get that project done is for there to be gods.
So that's the belief that that we are divinely created, we have divine purpose, but that divine purpose is, in fact, to spiritually mature towards a more godlike state. Right. That's the
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I said it said in some of the stuff I published that I've not. It depends on a sort of a premise that the self-made uh, moral being is sort of morally more excellent than the one who's sort of kind of gifted certain moral attributes. I mean, think of roughly the way we think about the difference between a self-made millionaire and somebody who just inherits the money. I mean, they somehow there's more excellence with the self-made millionaire. So one of the things I argued on that paper you mentioned was what was Christ's sacrifice? The people say, "Oh, I took on our sins" or something like that. But it seems to me that to really make sense of what the sacrifice would be, something like this: is that um, he sort of became the self, I mean, the inherited millionaire. He was more morally excellent than us, but in a sense, he didn't kind of earn it. He didn't have to go through the process. So he's always, I mean, he can never kind of be um, perfect in the way that God is because of kind of being gifted that. Whereas we could still have this possibility of becoming the self-made millionaires through our own acknowledgement of that. And so, in a sense, that we could, in fact, surpass Christ. And Christ's sort of sacrifice then is that permanent sort of second tier status. But yeah, so I mean, yeah, it all
that,
depends on a bunch of Christian background assumptions. But given all
yeah.
those, sort of the logic of it goes that way.
I hadn't picked up on that aspect of the argument. It reminds me of the fact that in Buddhism, there's a big distinction between the Buddha who did it on his own versus the everybody who achieves enlightenment afterwards by using the Buddha, because they didn't do it on their own. So that's somehow lesser. It's the same enlightenment, but some pigs are more equal than others.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
well, that's fascinating, and I do think that there's a connection here in that the religious questions that religious transhumanists are grappling with, or that lead people to want to meld religion with transhumanism, like me,
yeah, yeah,
is that the transhumanism, especially in its more libertarian versions, is unwilling to say much about, or most transhumanists have been unwilling to say much about what the ideal life is. What if you can't articulate what the eudaimonic goals are, then you're left with some like hedonic consequentialism. Just everybody should be happy, and you're not going to say that there are some kinds of happiness that are better than others. Religion's willing to say there's some kinds of happiness that are better than others, and I think it's also a techno-progressive emphasis in the question, because the complete libertarianism would say it's fine if we all end up taking our $1 a month UBI and spending it on, digital heroin and lying in the gutter. That would be fine. Versus the techno progressive, who has this more expansive eudaimonic view of what a future should be. So, do you see that connection as well? That both religion and techno progressivism want to say something about what the good life is?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. And even as a skeptical dogmatist, you'd think, well, you can't kind of like weigh in on this. So one sort of thought is like you said, it's sort of like the pure hedonic model. Another would be sort of a perfectionism, where it's the pleasure of happiness doesn't really count. It's all about kind of excellence, like the Stoics are in that vein, right? And then there's
Which is
kind
a
of
failure mode for religious transhumanism, I would imagine.
yeah, and then the sort of pluralism you get with like Aristotle, where well, you want to have a life with sort of both of these elements. As good skeptical dogmatists, I say, oh, each of those is probably wrong, but um, smart money will go with some sort of mixed model there because it has elements of both, so that if you get it wrong, at least you get some of what's good.
Yeah.
And yeah, I see something like that. I mean, liberalism has this, the usual sort of thought is that you can sort of choose any kind of lifestyle and stuff like that. But certainly the kind of push of a lot of the Enlightenment is yeah, you got those kinds of choices, but it's still the case that um, we have some view about which of those is better than others, and we will structure society to kind of nudge people that way. But we're also, in principle, open to some experimentation, but not at the not at the sort of the ground level. No, we want people to have to be autonomous, but have access to those kinds of versions of life that stood the test of time so far, right? So it's yeah, you can. I think it's always a kind of a balancing act, but I think there's some sort of consistent position there.
Hey, have you taken a look at Sen and Nussbaum's capabilities approach? Because for me, it's always
Yeah,
been an ideal compromise between the consequentialism and a more eudaimonic virtue theory.
yeah. I mean, I don't think the consequentialism is sort of incompatible with that. You want to sort of like maximize good lives, where the good life would involve not just happiness, but something like autonomy and maybe some other features. And the autonomy itself then will require things like development of your intellect, right? And sort of like sort of rational self-governance and so on like that, and other kinds of opportunities for developing your autonomy and stuff. So um, one day I hope to write a book called something like American Consequentialism, where the idea is to apply consequentialism at the state level, but what you're trying to do is maximize both sort of happiness and autonomy, and see if something. I don't think it would necessarily be right, but I think it would be enough. There'd be, if that model were taken as the base, that you could sort of see how a lot of other political traditions would kind of graft onto that. Always in agreement, but a lot of times there'd be lots of agreement, even if it's not for the same reason. So, like Rawls, of course, is more of a kind of continent, but I think the model would sort of say, well, we would have similar kinds of policy kinds of suggestions, even if Rawls's reasons are kind of more Kantian than the consequentialism. So some sort of structure like that, where you could graft different ones onto it quite easily. Left libertarianism might not look so much different from it, at the policy level and so on.
Yeah, it's one of the aspects that I like about the capabilities
Sorry.
approaches. You there?
Oh yeah, no, that's my turkey going. I've got to. Uh, sorry, my phone went off.
Oh, that's fine.
It sounds like if it sounds like a turkey on the audio there, it's because that's the notification thing. Sorry.
uh, so, you are in a university. You're teaching philosophy. I just stepped out of university after my entire life spent in
Yeah, yeah,
universities. Um, and I feel like I just stepped off. I feel like the opening scene of Pirates of the Caribbean when Jack Sparrow is on that sinking boat and he steps onto the pier as the boat sinks completely.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
That I just stepped off onto the pier. Um, AI is, of course, the looming over higher education right now. And before I left UMass Boston, we were giving talks for various audiences. And the kind of slogan that I had was we have to learn how to teach our students how to think without machines and how to think with machines. I still stand by that as a general dictum. But I think what we're seeing is that it's a hell of a lot easier for them to think with machines and become centaurs, to become have a kind of cyborg outcome where they really don't know how to do most things without the machine, but they can do them really well with machines. I know that that's even to me that's suboptimal because I think there are certain things that I would love to people for people to have in their meat and not just in their machine. But I don't see a way around it. How are you thinking about this these days, and how do you use AI in your classes?
Yeah, I do think about it, and when I do think about it, I make sure there's no ropes or sharp objects around, because it is really really depressing. I
Yeah.
mean, I have like objective evidence going back like 12 years of multiple choice kinds of questions for an intro class, and the average grade has dropped by at least 10%. It's probably closer to 15 now. So it's like
So you're seeing the overall
basically
dumbing down that people are talking about.
dumbing. Yeah, I mean, COVID didn't help, and then we got out of there. And, okay, this is going to take a few years, but yeah, and then AI comes along, and um, I had my classes take notes in class. I was just trying to figure out like the extent of the problem. So like, how come you're not doing well on quizzes where I talked about the stuff in class like 30 minutes ago, and like where you and you had them take notes, and the level of notes was just like I mean, I would have 10 years ago I would have guessed these are people in grade 10 or something like that.
Do you let them record your lectures?
No, um, partly um, partly for my classes tend to be more dialectical, so they're like I often like have a try to champion some outrageous argument like there's no material tables or something like that, and um and then they break into little groups, and then they got their task is to stump the chump, and so like randomly call on one group, okay, what do you got? But so it's because it's kind of dialectical, it's hard to follow that along, like, but also you can get quoted out of context. Like you could edit some of my lectures, and one of the sentences would be, "Thank God for Hitler." And now, if you just took that sentence, you're going to think I'm, some sort of monster. But it's to point out what some people call the zygote principle, that it's like for you to be you, that particular ovum and sperm had to kind of get together. That means that certain kinds of conditions had to be just right for your mom and dad to get together on that night at that time or
Right.
whatever.
If we
And
killed
if
baby
you change it,
Hitler, none of us would exist.
yeah, exactly right. So that's so you back the students into saying thank God for each step, and then I mean, if you start off saying I'm going to get you to say thank God for Hitler, and they're going, no, you're not, and then you back them, back them into that. But yeah, it's dangerous in a philosophy classroom to have
Well,
stuff.
plus there's also organizations out there that are asking right-wing students to tape your lectures and turn you in. So
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
yeah.
just a small bit of editing would, yeah, I'd be up at the end of a flagpole.
Head on a spike.
Yeah.
Well, do you like some professors now are using AI in the class and saying this is how I use it and this is how I think it's appropriate to use it, and but don't do this, don't give it your notes and tell it to write a paper for you, or what exactly are you doing with them pedagogically?
No, I mean, I agree that if they had sort of the right kind of skills, AI can be a great tool for that, but they just don't even have the most rudimentary, skills. It's like, I mean, math went through similar kinds of problems, right? And it's like, you have to learn how to do subtraction, addition, and division and stuff like that. And once you kind of got that mastered, yeah, then you can use the calculator, but you still have the sort of the basic kind of concepts there. Our students don't have the arithmetic, never mind, going on to thinking about calculus themselves. Like literally, they do not have that, and that's absolutely frightening. So, when I'm king, it'll be like only after you've reached a certain kind of level of mastery should we start thinking about how to integrate the AI afterwards. Um, but I don't see that
I
happening.
think that's right. And that's one of the reasons why I've softened on the issue of banning phones in schools and restricting access to social media and AI models to for under 16s or under 18s or whatever. I just feel like we are at a point where we haven't figured out what's appropriate for young people yet, and there seem to be. I'm not as anxious about social media psychosis or AI psychosis as
Mhm.
a lot of people are out there, because I think people used to. I knew there were people who were neurotic about reading books and getting overly involved with fictional characters, before there were computers. So the tendency of people to go psychotic in their relationship to popular culture or whatever is not new, but I do think it is a problem that we need to more, we need to regulate around it.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And again, that's what we were talking about earlier. Like, have a kind of model of the range of good lives, and then ask the sort of empirical question: Do these things, um, you know, promote that or detract from that? And um, that's sort of the consequential kind of leaning I have there. Right? It's sort of not doctrine. It's more like what action. It's there. Once you kind of got the normative ideal, and this like resolves to more like an empirical question there about how much it does promote that or not.
Your book, Happy People Pills for All, I found incredibly insightful. And one of the things that I think you make the case for in that book is that there is substantial evidence, and more since you wrote that mood, positive daily affect, as well as eudaimonic positive assessment of the quality of your life. Um, and we have to talk about those two things. But that both of those support and predict moral behavior. They predict pro-social behavior, agreeableness with others, self-control, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there's a chicken and egg problem, because if you're not, if you're addicted to heroin, you're lacking self-control, and then you may be miserable as well, or whatever.
Yeah, yeah,
So, but in general, so far as we can tease these things apart, happiness does seem to support moral behavior and virtue. Um, and I thought that that was a really important part of your argument. But uh, the other thing I always say to people is, look, if you look at the research on the relationship between happiness and behavior, um, most of us are suboptimal. Most of us are like just a little bit more happy than not happy. And the optimal place is like, if that's 6 on a 0 to 10 scale, the optimal place is someplace like 9 or 9.5. Because everything improves as you go up that scale. You have more friends, you have more love interests, you
yeah,
do better at work, you make more money, you live longer. But when you get to 10, the happiest 1% of all people, they begin to be dysfunctional in the way that they have they're overly optimistic about the future, and so they make poor judgments.
yeah.
They're verging on manic, basically. So, how did you address that in when you're thinking about happy pills for everybody? That we want people to be able to get to 9.5, but we don't want them to go to 10.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about that, but one of the things I was thinking about, I don't know if I mentioned in the book, was that it's like we don't know if that's sort of like a contingent limit, or some sort of like built-in feature. I mean, it might be somehow interacting with human nature, and of course, as transhumanists, we say, well, then so much the worse for human nature. But yeah,
Right.
so that's sort of like um, an empirical question. But yeah, you could imagine people taking who are already sort of naturally like, I don't know, like 8.5, and also now they're popped up to 10 or something. And then wouldn't that be overkill? Yeah, and again, that's sort of like an empirical question. And if you're straight out hedonist, you say, well, that's the perfect life. And if you're more like, I think the way you and I lean, it's like, well, no, there's sometimes it makes sense to sacrifice some happiness for that. The other thing is, maybe some more self-awareness or something like that. If you know you're a happy person and you got Homer Simpson's job there at the dials, then you're going to have to really need to inculcate in yourself some sort of intellectual virtues that, yeah, just because I'm feeling happy doesn't mean that the dials are, pointing in the right direction. So, yeah.
Is is moral enhancement a category of preference? I think it's called preference utilitarianism. That it's not that I want circumstances to make me happy. It's that I have certain desires about the kind of person I want to be over time, and I'll be happy if I can become that kind of person. Not that it's not that I want cigarettes and booze right now. I'm the kind of person who doesn't want to have cigarettes and booze right now, even though it would give me pleasure, but I would be even happier if I can be free of cigarettes and booze over the long term. Is that so? Is moral enhancement part of having of shifting our satisfactions to higher order, longer term aspirations?
Yeah, I mean, I think that would, as a transhumanist, you'd have to be all on board. I mean, you could sort of imagine kind of like you might call it like hair shirt enhancement, where you're like you're helping others and stuff. You find it excruciating, and that would be kind of horrible. And it's a nice choice about transhumanism. The kind of thing I push in that happy book too is um, it's sometimes you don't have to. I mean, those are philosophical thought experiments, but sometimes reality cooperates, so you don't have to choose. You don't have to choose between excellence and happiness because you can have it all. And
Mm-hmm.
that's exactly, I think, what you would want with sort of moral unhappiness. You want to do some self-making. I want to be a morally better person, but I also would like to take joy in that. And I think part of the empirical literature says that people do get a lot more joy in helping people than they kind of realize. But if we're doing genetic modifications or taking pills or whatever, you want to have both things in the pill. That would be the best thing for other people and best thing for yourself.
The connection between moral enhancement and policy, I think, is where people haven't come after us yet with pitchforks for this, but I think that they could eventually. Because if you start to say, as I would want to say, that the government has an obligation to community mental health, to population level interest in mental health, um, and one of the part of mental health is that you don't have extreme obsessions, and extreme racism could be an example of an extreme pathological obsession.
Mm-hmm.
And we already have laws about what kinds of behavior would get you arrested and even involuntarily treated psychiatrically. So we already have at the margins, we have the coercive potential of the state to enact community guidelines about what kinds of brains we want to have.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then we can have debates about things like extreme racism or misogyny, like incels shooting up, schools of women and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, I think that's where the rubber begins to meet the road. And when we can say, okay, what do we think? If we came up with a drug whose principal purpose was to make you less racist, or
Yeah,
make
yeah.
you, which psychedelics do, in fact, but that's another story. But so the legalization of psychedelics is partly about this kind of issue of turn on and tune in kind of
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
argument for society. But do you think it should be a part of public policy to say that we think certain kinds of brain? I'm saying it already is on the margins, but
Yeah,
even
yeah.
more, that we should be arguing for moral enhancement as something that the state should be supporting.
Yeah, I do. But one of the things that so when I wrote the genetic virtue and the happy people pills articles and book and stuff like that, I was a bit more of a dogmatist in those. I don't mean like closed-minded, but I was kind of more confident about my views. And then I started thinking, well, it seems sort of so obvious in some ways. How is it that you even get kind of pushed back? And of course, there's all sorts of explanations why. some is just sort of knee jerk and stuff. But there are people who seem otherwise, you know, intelligent and sort of good-hearted and stuff like that. How's it there's still that kind of disagreement? That's how I got off on this other kind of skeptical dogmatism project. It looks kind of unrelated to the earlier stuff, but it was sort of like, at least in my intellectual development, it sort of I got pushed that way. And so when I think about your kind of argument, I'm like totally on board. So like that's the end state. But this question I was asking myself is like, how do we get from here to there? And that's the hard part. And I think it might be like with embryo selection, it's sort of easier to um, get the kind of traits that are universally agreed upon as sort of negative traits and allow that in this policy. And then, as our opponents say, we would hope that there would be this sort of creep towards, thinking that the traits that you could select would be broader. In the case of, the kind of antisocial behavior you're talking about, which might lead to imprisonment or otherwise confinement and stuff like that, seems like if we can do moral enhancement, at least for those people who are on that end of the extreme, you could sort of see that being something that there might be more agreement about. And then,
Mm-hmm.
people kind of get comfortable with it. The happy people pills, I don't know if there's any literature on the racism thing, but generally, as you mentioned, it's sort of like it pushes you to be more pro-social. And there's sort of other reasons, like sort of, for autonomy and stuff like that. There might be broader agreement on that people should be able to access these things so long as they're not sort of harming somebody else in the sort of millionth. That might be the way to kind of look for the areas where there's the broadest agreement, and then sort of move forward from there.
Well, it's interesting. Your interest in intellectual virtue is that we should be less tribal, ideologically tribal, and more open to the ambiguities.
More
Um,
well, shouldn't be so confident. So let me just give you like a baby example. Suppose there's like three political theories. You got Rawls, who's a sort of a liberal, and you got Nozick as a libertarian, and Gerald Cohen as a socialist or something like that, right? So suppose Rawls was actually a famously kind of modest person, but suppose he thought that there's only a 52% chance that he's right about his view. Sounds pretty modest, just better than a coin flip. If he thinks he's right, then he's got to think that Nozick and Cohen are wrong. And that leaves 48% probability for the two of them. That means that if you divide it evenly, they would have a 24% chance of being right. He's got a 52% chance, right? Anytime you have one of these disagreements with three or more views and you think you're at least more than likely right than not, you have to think of yourself as an uber epistemic superior, being able to put the beat down on the other two of them in terms of truth. And that, when you think about that, sort of sounds um, not too like a little dearth of intellectual humility there. I mean, think about it in any other area of life where number one thinks that they could kind of put the beat down on two and three. I think Muhammad Ali was famous for being a great bragger, and he once said that he could beat up George Foreman and Joe Frazier in the same evening. So like he'd get in the ring and beat up one, and then next one would come up. Even that wouldn't be analogous because he's taking them on individually. It'd have to be like Joe Frazier and George Foreman in the ring against Ali at the same time.
but
They would crush him, right?
but
Yeah, and so yeah, so I think of any other area of life where one and two couldn't kind of combine their powers and beat up on number one. And every other area of life, it's always the case that one and two could easily take on two and three could take on number one, except for when it comes to philosophical views. Then we're confident.
But in terms of what you're proposing, it seems to be along the lines of the classic dilemma of liberalism versus conservatism, that liberals embrace the idea that we should have epistemic uncertainty and commit to intellectual virtue. And it seems like a lot of conservatives don't. And as a consequence, liberals always seemed unarmed in debates because we're the ones who are saying, well, yes, evolution is just a theory, but it's a pretty good theory, and then the other ones are going, aha, but I have the truth. Um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and
It's
so
it,
really
it is.
the people, if we could come up with an epistemic uncertainty pill, we should be giving it to the conservatives. Well, I think the liberals have taken enough of that drug.
Yeah, yeah. No, look, I agree that when it comes to public fights, I mean, but it sort of does explain then why we're at least have that persona of overconfidence. It seems like that's the way to kind of win the battle. But that's kind of consistent with what I was saying. I was like most of humanity is ignorant. They're ignorant and they are ignorant about their ignorance. And then part of the fun of the next book is to try to sort of how do you navigate in that world full of ignorance and stuff like that. So
Dunning,
yeah,
Kruger
yeah,
effect.
yeah,
People, the
exactly.
more
Yeah,
ignorant people are, the less they realize it.
yeah. I mean, yeah, it got named recently, but you can find exactly that kind of talk in Plato's dialogues in various places. Yeah, so he doesn't get the credit for it as he should.
Well, if we can come up with the moral enhancement suite that I want, I have sometimes joked that I might have to rename Cyborg Buddha to the care and feeding of post-fascist prisoners in re-education camps or something like that.
Oh,
Because
jeez.
I walk around and since Trump was elected in 2016, but it just gets worse and worse. It's like, really, a third of my country doesn't understand X. It's like, it's so obvious. It's right there in front of you. The whole Epstein
Yeah,
thing.
well, yeah, I mean, when I do that, like I, need to talk myself back from the edge of the ledge, I think, now remember, half the population reads at, grade 7 or below level. And say, would you would you be surprised if a 10-year-old thought Trump was the greatest thing in the world? No. Well, then,
Okay,
yeah.
people are morally weak, and we're all getting dumber. And as a consequence of AI, we may not even need to have jobs anymore. Um, and so the last topic, you wrote a book about universal basic income. One of the worries that people have about universal basic income, if it were to be implemented, would be that it would be very meager, because we're going to have a political fight about redistribution, as we always do,
Mm.
and we probably won't be able to get a very generous UBI, at least at first. And then it may just be a way of ticking over an unfair system where Bezos and Thiel get to sit at the top of billions of dollars and dole out pennies to us and keep us pacified. Um, do you think we're at the point where the fight is how generous the UBI should be? I mean, we still have to accomplish a UBI. We still haven't created UBIs in very many places yet. But where do you think we're at with this fight? And are you worried about conservative UBI being an alternative out there?
Well, I mean, I am in the short term and so on, but I mean, and I don't know how that fight will play out, and I'm not sure how effective we'll be in that. Yeah, so it's easy to be pessimistic about that, but the larger picture, I'm more optimistic about. One of the things I argued in that book is that Marx missed out on what I call the second law of production. The first law is the usual one, which is over time the amount of human labor to make a widget goes down, right? So I mean that's everybody left and right agrees. Historically, that's the case. I mean, once upon a time, it took 90% of the population to make enough food for themselves, and the extra 10%. Now it's fewer than 2% of the population is involved in agricultural production. So it's just enormous gains in productivity. So Marx was on board with that, and Adam Smith's on board with that. So the second law of production sort of says something to like this: is that the means of production over time change from capital goods to consumer goods. And what that means is that the stuff that in the day was really expensive and the capital sort of owned it and used that to oppress people, over time it becomes that means of production gets cheaper and it can be a mere consumer good. One of the examples I use in the book was the case of ice. Back in the day, they used to have people chop up big chunks of a frozen lake, and then they have these big storehouses, and they come on trains, and they go to the local warehouse, and then the little icemen would come up and down the street and stuff like that. I mean, you think about all the capital that was involved in there, it was all the usual sort of exploitation and stuff like that. But like, I don't want to brag, but I've got like an ice making machine in my house now, right? And it's like, right, and all the capitalists, that all those capitalists are sort of dependent on owning that capital and using that to have these sort of oppressive relationships. It wasn't social revolution that changed it. It was technological revolution, and so the more and more of that sort of happens with the means of production being more um, localized within a house or a smaller community and stuff like that, the less we have to kind of worry about the kind of macro issues, at least for distribution. So I mean, you can already sort of see that, but you can imagine like um, intentional communities, popping up. I'm interested in cyborg Buddhism too, and you some land that's relatively inexpensive and people producing their own electricity. I got like 1,700 kilowatts of solar panels in there and stuff. I'm
Yeah,
self
me too.
yes self-sufficient that way, right? And 3D printers and stuff like that. So the amount that you would sort of have to worry about for UIB will get smaller and smaller. If you got this intentional community too, you sort of do the old well, you got some plumbing skills, so you can help Jay with his bathroom renovation projects and stuff like that. So I sort of vision a future where the part of the problem won't be solved so much socially, but kind of technology will undermine those who try to oppress us, because it's just sort of the nature of that. Um, it's always the case that the big means of production get cheaper and cheaper. You probably remember as a kid too, this sort of thing. Remember when, like, the cat would go missing or whatever. When you do it, you'd like make type up something on the typewriter and you put a little picture of Kitty there and you take it down to the printer and then staple. Again, I don't want to brag, but I got my own little printing press in my house. It's that sort of phenomenon. More that goes on, uh, the less we'll have to solve that kind of social problem. At least at that level. I'm not saying there's not going to be a lot of other ones, but that one, I think, technology will kind of undermine the dialectic.
So you're pointing to the decentralization of technological capabilities, but are you also pointing to the declining cost of doing things? Because I think this is one of the, I've just talked to David Wood for this series, and David is certainly of the opinion that automation is going to make everything cheaper, and that as employment declines and it potentially has an impact on many of our wages, that will be okay, or could be okay, if the price of things is declining at the same time. Is that something in your framework? Or
Yeah, yes. I mean, that what's going to cause humans to face technological unemployment? Well, the answer is basically robotics, right? But one of the things that gets cheaper with robotics is robots, right? And so so yeah, it'll be really hard for our good old capitalist friends to keep that oppressive relationship, because they're going to have to somehow keep the prices of robots artificially high, and we just don't see it. I mean, we already see that with home 3D printers and stuff like that. There'd be this sort of business there where it will be self-undermining, in the sense that their capital goods get cheaper and cheaper, and so they lose their leverage. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, sorry.
well, just no, humanoid robotics, I completely agree, are the next big shoe to drop, because the LLMs have been an attack and are increasingly an attack on white collar employment. But we needed really the humanoid robots in order for there to be a substantial dent in blue collar employment. Although self-driving trucks, that affects 5 million American workers, and so there are other areas that don't need necessarily humanoid robots, but just robotization in general.
Yeah, and all those technologies will become cheaper over time, and it's just like something like a robotic car or something like that. You're not nobody's going to have a monopoly on that because there's a whole bunch of different ways. I mean, I don't totally don't get why Tesla has its the market valuation it does now because there's no kind of moat there for any of these things and so once there's no moat, that just means they're going to get cheaper and cheaper.
Yeah, I mean, Chinese electric vehicles won, and we're just shooting ourselves in the foot by not allowing them to be sold here. I guess Canada is really going big on Chinese electric vehicles.
Yeah, they got like a 50,000 quota to begin with, sort of like to ease the public into that and stuff like that. But yeah, we are I'm surprised we're not trying to bring back horse-drawn carriages or something like that. I mean, at least it'd be more fun.
Um, well, you are Canadian American. You could would you
And
accept that?
Australia, triple threat.
Triple threat and Australia.
I
So
got
yeah,
places to run.
so Australia's got Labor government, good for them. Carney is a liberal, good for him. He gave a great speech a couple weeks ago
Yeah, I
about
thought that was a nice little
the
look at history. Yeah,
right decline of the rules based order, and I very much hope that he's right that we're going to build a new one and do it right this time. Um, but between those three countries, I mean, we have to defeat fascism in the United States first. But after that, I'm very anxious about what's going to happen with technology policy in the coming backlash to what's been happening, because the anti AI data centers, anti oligarchs, um, we might get a UBI out of it because people may be sufficiently anxious about technological unemployment now to do that, and we might get billionaire taxes out of it, and that'd be great. But do you see that there is in the political fight that's shaping up that AI is going to be a big loser here? That it's going to get whacked even more heavily than it was Biden's attempts to just lightly regulate AI that led the tech right to say, well, fuck you, we're going to become Republicans. And now I think it's going to be a lot worse.
yeah, I mean, you know, I've given up even thinking I have even the slightest idea what's going to happen. I mean, I just, I couldn't. I mean, Trump. I mean, gosh, it's so disconnected with what you would think would happen. So yeah, I don't know in the short term. I mean, I think our strategy needs to be double pronged. One is, obviously to pay attention to these things at the national level, but I also think that and we don't do enough of this as a techno progressive community, is try to work out sort of alternates to that don't require us to kind of have the national level fight like the sort of intentional communities I was suggesting. Like, yeah, we're not going to be able to do a pure one like that right now, but it's still the case that we could do something, at least analogous. Maybe people could find remote work and work in these intentional communities if they work 4 hours still in the bigger economy, but you're working on models about how we can work at a more local level to pursue the good life with some of our neighbors and stuff like that. I mean,
I'm
that would
sure
be it.
you remember that when we were leaving the World Transhumanist Association, as the now in retrospect, the people affiliated with Thiel and Musk and people like that were taking over. That one of the things that they wanted us to start talking about was seasteading. And my initial reaction to the seasteading was, well, if you're talking about intentional communities, they could be anywhere. They could be within the United States. They don't need to be in international waters. Why do you want it in international waters? So you can do illegal stuff that's illegal in all other countries? Well, what things might those be? When, and now we know some of the things that they might want to do.
Yeah.
But I think that, well, I lost my train of thought. So
Yeah.
Matt, oh, intentional communities. I mean, I actually, as a high school student, I wrote papers about intentional communities and was very much interested in them. And there was a group called The Farm down in Tennessee. It's still there. commune, and it got up to like 1,700 members. And I convinced my mom to take me and my brother down to visit the farm for a weekend. That's how interested we were in the intentional community experience. I mean, on the other hand, I am also enough of a socialist to say that intentional communities are a distraction from social change, and that if you're spending all your time on your polycule, you're probably not a very effective organizer out there in the rest of the world. But I do think that you're right. These bottom up, instantiating the future that we want in our lives today has always been a part of what the left needs to be doing, or progressives or social change needs to be doing. And technologically, it makes even more sense, that we should be trying out some of these technologies and seeing if they work.
Yeah, I mean,
Even if,
you can buy 3D printing machines and little robotic gardeners and stuff like that. I imagine that part of it is too, though. I mean, they sound like disparate strategies, but I also think there's sort of a unifying idea there too, which is from the old anarchist sort of thought, like, how do you get rid of the king? Well, king's like a pedestal, and everybody else sort of supports the king. All you have to do, you don't need to put your hands on his throat. You just need to kind of withdraw your support, and the more kind of people, if they work, if intentional communities work, where people are looking to be, use technology so they're not like living like primitives, but they can still pursue the good life without having to buy the latest fads and stuff like that to keep up with the Joneses and stuff like that. That might be a way to kind of also undermine the conditions that make capitalism right now sort of possible. Is this people on this kind of little squirrel wheel, or a hamster wheel, I should say, that sort of leads nowhere. It's a lot of we've got all this extra productivity, but I don't see that translating into better lives. I haven't seen that for a long. I mean, it did for a long time. It did, but it hasn't lately.
yeah, I mean, I think for techno progressives like social democrats in general, we would emphasize that yes, capitalism did unlock, as Marx did, capitalism unlocked productive capacities and knitted the world together and did a lot of positive stuff. But in the 20th century, everything that we got good from it had to come through struggle, the labor union struggle and social democratic parties and so forth. So the capitalism by itself doesn't give you anything. I
No.
think that's one of the lessons today is, Mateo and I just put up an episode where we were talking about the enshittification thesis, which and how it relates to kind of techno-fascist ideas. But the enshittification thesis of Cory Doctorow is just that the natural tendency of capitalism is the concentration of capital, and that leads to monopoly, and monopoly leads to them not caring less and less about providing good quality services for low prices. So it's the whole cycle and dynamic is intrinsic to capitalism.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's that every capitalist dream is to overcome capitalism by having the monopoly, right? I mean,
which Peter Thiel has explicitly said. He said,
yeah.
You should all be trying to become monopolies. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I mean, typically when we talk about capitalism, we mean like private ownership of the means of production and free markets. And the free markets, though, are incompatible with the me accumulating as much wealth as possible. I'm always going to do better when there's a monopoly,
Mm-hmm.
and we've never been able to keep both of those together without strong government interference. Interference, that is. Otherwise, I mean, this goes back thousands of years. It was always, people aren't allowed to sign, little pacts to make monopolies or whatever. Like, we'll band together, and anybody new comes into the business, will undercut our prices. That sort of stuff's made illegal. So that's why the libertarianism always seemed to me like a fantasy. It's like you always need government in there. There's no natural free markets. They're all artificial. They have to be socially maintained.
Right. This antitrust stuff, which I'm a big supporter of, but I was just trying to keep up with everything that was happening with Paramount and Warner Brothers yesterday,
Mhm.
Which is, on the one hand, it's a story of a billionaire buying toys for his fail son to break, basically.
Yeah.
And so,
That's a
which,
nice way to bottom line it. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, which like I really don't care in the end, except there are some nice intellectual properties in Warner Brothers that I wish they wouldn't break, but I guess that's what's going to happen. But on the other hand, it's the reason that they won that fight against Netflix was that the Ellisons were said explicitly to Trump, who had already said that he wanted political changes in CNN and these other properties, and that was the reason he was favoring Paramount. And then Paramount said explicitly to Warner Brothers, we've been giving bakshish to Trump so we can get this past the antitrust test. And it's like, okay, well, that's not the way it's supposed to work, right? That's clearly broken what you're doing there.
Yeah. No, I mean, you knew that some of this stuff was happening sort of behind closed doors before, but Christ, I mean, it's
It's
so
the one.
blatant now. It's like, yeah,
It's
we're
the one
so,
great virtue is that they say the quiet part out loud. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, we're so inured to it. Oh my gosh.
Well,
Now I,
Mark, it's been a delight, and thank you again for 20 years of service to the IIT, 22 years, something like that.
yeah, yeah,
And you were the one who first pulled me into this transhumanist network because you saw a paper of mine about brain death, and you invited me to submit it to the Journal of Transhumanism,
yeah,
which you were editing, and that was 25 years ago, so 30 years ago. So
yeah.
I'm really, it's been a long row, and I think we've still got a couple more tricks up our sleeves. So,
Yeah, I wanted to say that, I was thinking about, the history of our organization and how sort of fortuitous, you mentioned it earlier, but there was this, we had that old sort of transhumanist discussion group on like Yahoo or something like that. And there was that question of whether we should be like a big tent or more social democratic kind of leaning organization. And I wanted the more social democratic one, and we lost that kind of war. I mean that battle there, but I think we won the war um, because we by being more focused on what we did and setting up the WTA and so on like that, and then eventually IET. That was actually the better long term move. I mean
I,
that this
I
is
think
so
about that.
much
Yeah, I think about
too.
that
This
quite
is so much
often.
stronger than it would have been, I think, if it had been otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, Nick Bostrom got $10 million for the Martin Institute and setting up the Future of Humanity Institute, and I think they did great work. And I'm sorry that he wasn't his work habits weren't compatible with Oxford's expectations. Um, but I think in general, we have, in the long term, we have benefited from the fact that we held to our principles sufficiently that we never attracted the interests of the Epsteins and the Teals and the Musks. We weren't going after Musk's money. Which in retrospect, given the wealth that they had and the other kinds of charities that they supported, they were giving chump change to
Yeah, 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 yeah.
AI safety, transhumanism. They what $20,000 gift to the WTA. That's the principal way that the WTA appears in the Epstein files is he gave one $20,000. That's nothing. That's chump change. So
Yeah.
the idea that this is all a Tescrielite conspiracy. These are the evil transhumanist Illuminati who are trying to
Yeah.
reduce the global population by putting chips in everybody is like, what the hell are you talking about? But
Yeah,
anyway, yeah, we lucked out because they were never interested in us because of what we were talking about.
but also being more sort of focused. It was easier us to kind of build, from the sort of broadly kind of political agreement, so rather than, as you remember, the WTA, we like spent all our time
Should there
arguing.
be a government? That was the first question.
Yeah, yeah, and it's like, yeah, you're never going to get anything done if you can't kind of have some kind of broad agreement. So yeah,
Yeah,
I was very fortunate to run into you, sir.
you as well. Okay, and I'll just remind everybody we've got a summer course planned. We'll be putting up a registration form for that shortly, mid of June to mid of September. Course with me and Matteo McDermott, and we'll probably be asking people like Mark Walker to come and give us some guest wisdom in that course. And
Do you
then
have
we're
any
having.
details on, is it open to the public or
It
your
is
course?
open, well, pre-registration, but
Yeah, yes, yeah.
yeah, it'll be free and open to the public. Yeah.
Good, because I have a couple students I might send your way.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And then we've got a conference September 19th and 20th in London. And I hope that you all can join us there to discuss the need for an international network to promote techno-progressive ideas. Thanks so much, Mark.
Thank you, James.
The Techno-Progressive Hub is sponsored by the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies and hosted by me, Jay Hughes. Find us at Substack at Techno-Progressives.